All right, welcome to Democracy in the Constitution. This is number 10, presentation number 10 in the Constitution seminar series. And the first thing to be noted about this presentation is democracy in the Constitution is a bad name. Why? Because democracy doesn't show up. The word democracy doesn't show up anywhere in our federal Constitution, nor in any of the 50 state constitutions. There simply isn't democracy in the Constitution. So it's kind of a funny way to start it by saying it's a bad name. But that's something to know about this presentation. We're going to get into this, but what I do when I do these presentations, I go through and I gather all the quotes I can possibly find, and I put them together, and I grab all the constitutional references and pull those all together and come up with all these ideas that I think are helpful and beneficial. At the end of this presentation, I had 5 or 6 quotes left over. I didn't know where to fit them in, so I thought, well, I'll just put them at the beginning. And it turns out that they're kind of interesting to look at, and they apply very much to this whole concept. So we're going to go through some slides and some quotes from the founders and kind of contrast those with the liberals and progressives, okay? First one here is by George Washington. He says, "We must take human nature as we find it. Perfection falls not to the share of mortals." That's an interesting thing to say, isn't it? That we as human beings aren't perfect. We have to take that. We have to accept that and understand that that's just how it is. There's a man named Herbert Croly, a leader in the progressive movement. He said this: "Human nature can be raised to a higher level by an improvement in institutions and laws." In other words, the way to change human nature is just to give the government more power. If we just had an agency for that, or a bureaucrat to fix that, we could fix that. We can change human nature. George Washington says, no, we can't. We have to accept it how it is. Okay? Along the same lines here, Thomas Jefferson says, "Human nature is the same on every side of the Atlantic, and will be alike influenced by the same causes. The time to guard against corruption and tyranny is before they shall have gotten a hold on us." Okay? That's the founders' view. Progressives say something along the lines of some humans are more equal than others, right? That's communism. Some are more equal than others. And they should govern those who aren't as enlightened. They attempt to set themselves up as gods on earth and to ruthlessly force their views on all others with the abiding assurance that the end justifies the means. Okay? So typically what we could say is, well, yeah, we know that there's corruption in the EU. We know that communist China and socialist Germany have corrupt leaders, but that doesn't happen here in the United States. Jefferson says, no, human nature is the same on both sides of the Atlantic, and we need to guard against that. Okay? Here's a pretty famous quote by James Madison. "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls in government would be necessary." So in government, by necessity, men are trusted with power and force, right? The force of government. The progressives say we can trust men in positions of power who are guided by altruistic goals and who have put off their self-interest and only seek the public good. Whereas Madison says, look, men aren't angels. And just because someone's in government doesn't make them an angel. If men were angels, they'd need no government, but men aren't angels, okay? And so we understand the opposite side there again. John Adams says, "It's weakness rather than wickedness which renders men unfit to be trusted with unlimited power." And according to Adams, who has that weakness? All men, all mankind, right? Just like Lord Acton said that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay? Nobody is immune. All mankind's immune, both those in the public and those in the public service. And so we shouldn't trust any of them with absolute power. The progressives, on the other hand, say, no, we can, because they understand these things. They know how to govern. They're elite. They're progressed, right, in how they think and how they understand things. Madison says, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence." So we're kind of dual beings, right? There's things about us that we can't trust, but there's also things about us that we need to unleash and say, yeah, go for it. That's a great, good, righteous, godly desire, right? We need to get out of the way. He says, "Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form." This idea of a republic, right? We're a republic. We talked about this. We're not a democracy, we're a republic, a rule of law. A republic presupposes the idea that we have things we need to restrain and have government use their force to restrain us on. We also have things that government needs to get out of the way and let the people in their own endeavors become the great people they can be. Lastly, Madison says, "Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another." You can't possibly, people are saying, and Madison's saying it's not true, you can't possibly trust people to govern themselves. They don't have enough virtue. They would destroy themselves. And the progressives said, look, people need to be told what to do. They don't know how to handle freedom because they're incapable of ever doing good. The progressives say, we're here to save the day because you guys who don't know how, even though you may not like our control and our bureaucracy, etc., we're here because we're here to do good for you. We're here to control you because you can't control yourself. Okay, so what I did is I put together a little chart that I think is interesting. I compared the founders and the progressives. The founders, according to them, man's nature is fallen but has a high potential. Okay, that duality of our human nature. According to the progressives, man's nature, they don't have any virtue. They are selfish. According to the founders, we are dependent upon God and morality to fix that fallen portion of our nature. Progressives say we're dependent upon the government. Founders say man's self-interest is a positive force if not used to infringe on others' rights. It's a good thing to have people have self-interest. That profit motive impels action, right? Okay? The progressives say that man's self-interest must be eliminated and replaced with the public interest, the collective good. Okay? Founders say that rights are based individually. The progressives say that rights are based collectively. The rule of law under the founders' model and the progressives' model is the rule of the elite, because after all, they know better. Okay? The proper role of government, according to the founders, is to protect individual rights. It's a negative force. Okay? It acts on those who infringe on other people's rights. It's negative. Okay? It's to protective. Whereas the proper role of government in progressives is a providential. It provides needs and wants. It's a positive force. We're going to help you. We're going to give you. We're going to change you. That's how the progressives see it. Legitimate laws in the founders' model uphold natural law. They coincide with natural law. Whereas in the progressive model, the legitimate laws are there to change man's nature. Okay? Now, the ultimate goal in the founders is freedom and prosperity, and the ultimate goal under the progressives is utopia, where there's no self-interest. Okay? I don't know. To me, that's an interesting little set of quotes in a comparison, a chart there to give us an idea and really get us, I think, on the right foundation to understand, okay, here's why there are different thoughts about how human nature is and how government should interact with human nature. It's maybe a good foundation for starting our presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to work with some more models here, okay? We're going to discuss some different issues. A lot of times, it's interesting with this economic system we're going to put together. We're going to have a spectrum here. Sometimes we call things that are really economic terms governmental terms and vice versa. Looking through this, it may be just semantics, but I think it helps lend a little bit of understanding to the whole issue at hand here. So in an economic system, the whole point revolves around this idea of the ownership of capital. Capital is the means of production, okay? Now, in parentheses there we have its title and its use. You can have title to capital, to property, but if you can't control its use, then you really don't own it, yeah. In fact, out of the two aspects, it's more important to have control over the use of the capital rather than just to have the title of it. Okay, so the two different spectrums. On the right-hand side here, we have individual ownership of capital. On the left-hand side, we have a state ownership of capital. So on the right-hand side, the economic system based on individual ownership of capital is called capitalism. Okay, but as we discussed just a few presentations ago in the economics in the Constitution presentation, all forms of economic systems are capitalistic. So we're going to replace this word capitalism with the word free market. Free market says individuals own and control title and use of the capital. Okay? Moving up the scale a little bit, we'll hit this thing called fascism. Now, fascism is private ownership but government control. Okay? The famous fascist dictatorship is Mussolini's Italy, right? He says, look, we're going to tell you what to produce, how much, who to hire, at what cost, where to get your production supplies, who to fire, all that stuff. Oh, but then you can decide the rest, right? So they have complete control even though you have ownership. And it's actually a very effective way to run it because then the people who own the building paint it, keep it clean, take some pride in it, but really it's completely controlled. They have the title, but the government controls the use of the resources, okay, the use of the capital. That's fascism. One step further is called socialism, which is government ownership, control, and use of the major industries. Major industries like banking or student loans or automobiles. That sound vaguely familiar? Maybe like the United States of America. Okay, government ownership of the different banks, the money system, the automobile. Yeah. Some people say we're progressing towards socialism. They're not just saying things full of hot air. Let's look at what's going on. If the definition is ownership, control, and use of the major industries, that's exactly what is happening in America. Okay, one more up the scale here is communism. Communism is state ownership, control, and use of all the capital in every industry of the country. Okay, whereas socialism is just major industries. Communism outright, openly own everything. The state owns it and controls it. Okay, now There's a different scale here, and you can see that the communist is all the way to the left where the state is, whereas a free market is all the way to the right where the individual controls that market. Okay? On a side note, it's interesting how advocates of communism and socialism and fascism always say this is a people's movement. It's for the common man. But under communism and its various aspects, the common man becomes a slave to the system. They're not enabled. It's not really a people's movement. It's a people's suppression. They become slaves in the system. This is an interesting economic side note there. In relation to that last comment, Tocqueville put it this way. America extends the sphere of individual freedom. Socialism restricts it. America attaches all possible value to each man. Socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. America and socialism have nothing in common but one word, equality. But notice the difference. While America seeks equality and liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. Okay, the next spectrum we're going to deal with here regards governmental systems. Governmental systems have everything to do with governmental power. On the right-hand side, you have no governmental power. On the left-hand side, you have 100% governmental power. Okay? What's it called when there's no governmental power? What's that system of government called? That's anarchy. Okay? Anarchy means rule by no one. No one's in charge. Okay? Now, all the way to the left, up on the upper left-hand corner, we have what's called a monarchy. What's monarchy mean? Mono, rule by one, okay? Rule by a king or a dictator, a potentate, okay? A little bit further down is an oligarchy. Oligarchy means rule by a few, okay? Or rule by the elite, okay? A little bit further down then, the scale is what is called democracy. There we find democracy, okay? Democracy is the rule by majority, okay? Rule by majority. And lastly, we have somewhere towards the right, but not at the very end of the right, is what is called a republic. Republic means rule of law. All right, now let's look at each of these. There's 5 different governmental systems. Let's try to discover if there's some that truly don't exist. They're not really permanent. When you look at a monarchy, for example, you have a king, you have a potentate, you have a dictator, but does one person really rule? Or do they really surround themselves with a small group of elitists who really rule in their place? Rule with them. It's rule with them, right? So really, a monarchy disappears. It's not a legitimate long-term form of government. An oligarchy is what 99% of the nations of the world are under, is a rule of the elite. Okay? An oligarchy is very much alive and well in today's world. Move one more down, is a democracy. Okay? The democracy has garnered a lot of attention from the founders. There's been tons and tons of quotes. We'll go through a lot of them today. The first one I want to bring attention to is John Adams. He says this: democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. Okay? If it's rule of majority, who are the majority going to start preying on? The minority, right? And eventually the minority is going to run out of resources, and the majority is going to say, hey, what's going on here? And things collapse, and they commit suicide. The system itself has no other choice but to commit suicide. There's no one else to prey on. Okay? The majority can't vote in benefits from the minority. Madison concurs. He says, democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and in general have been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. So talk real quickly with me about the Arab Spring, right? The democratic uprisings. How long did those last before they turned into dictatorships in Egypt and Syria and Libya? Okay? These guys understood history. This isn't a founding father, obviously, but this is very much an interesting quote that I think sums up really concisely what we're trying to say. A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy, always followed by a dictatorship. Okay? So we've got Adams saying it commits suicide. We have Madison saying that it is violent in its death. We have Alexander Tytler saying that it is followed by a dictatorship. They're all saying the same things. Democracies are bad. Okay, so let's look again at this on this spectrum. What happens to democracy? All 3 of these witnesses say, well, democracy always turns into anarchy. Complete chaos. No government by nobody, because the democracy says, hey, majority doesn't have anyone else to pick on anymore, and it turns into an anarchy. Now, when you look at what happens with an anarchy, though, the anarchy turns, how long does an anarchy really last? Not long at all. Rule by no one? Of course someone's going to step forward and say, I'll rule. What happened with Hitler? I'll take care of this chaos. Just give me your guns and let me be in charge of all the laws, and I'll give you security. And people clamored for him, said, yeah, let's do that. Anarchy never lasts long. It's not a permanent form of government. So anarchy turns into an oligarchy, which is a dictatorship, which coincides with the things that our other founders have said. George Washington says this too. There's a natural and necessary progression from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny. Okay? Witness after witness is saying this is how it works. And so when it really comes down to it, the only two stable forms of government are an oligarchy, which is rule by the state, right? Has governmental power, or a republic, which is rule by law. Those are two choices. That's what it comes down to in the governmental systems. Now, our third spectrum, our final one that we're going to analyze, is the philosophical system. That all has to do everything with rights and duties. Okay? On the right-hand side, once again, you have individuals. On the left-hand side, you have the state. This is really a simple model. We're not going to spend much time on it. But on the right-hand side, you have what's called individualism. Okay? Where rights and duties are based in individuals. On the left-hand side, the rights and duties are based in the state. That's called collectivism, where the group is more important than the individual. So, when you combine these three together, we're going to look at this and say philosophically on the right-hand side, or first of all, the basis behind this spectrum is the ownership of capital, the power, and the rights. Okay? Right-hand side, you have individual. Left-hand side, you have the state. So philosophically, you have individualism on the right, collectivism on the left. Okay? Economically, you have capitalism or free market. You have communism on the left, and communism in all its forms, correct? Governmentally, you have either a republic or you have an oligarchy. See, look at this. Collectivism, communism, and oligarchy, or individualism, capitalism, or free market, and a republic. Interesting to look at that and understand, oh, that's what America is. And really when it comes down to it, it's liberty versus tyranny. That's what it really is. Okay? So, to get those, hopefully get our minds around those definitions, let's go on to the definition of democracy itself. Okay, this is kind of a long definition. It's very well done, though. It says, a government of the masses, authority derived through mass meeting or any other form of direct expression, results in mobocracy. Attitude toward property is communistic, negating property rights. Attitude to the laws that the will of the majority shall regulate, whether it's be based on deliberation or governed by passion, prejudice, and impulse, without restraint or regard to consequences, results in demagogism, license, agitation, discontent, and anarchy. That sound like a right-wing extremist definition of democracy? Here they go on to say this definition. The framers of the Constitution, quote, made a very marked distinction between a republic and a democracy, and said repeatedly and emphatically that they had formed a republic. Okay? Who wrote this definition of democracy? Would it surprise you to know that it was written by the War Department in 1928? Okay, the predecessor to the Department of Defense. The War Department in 1928 in their training manual said democracies are bad. Okay, they're saying they're communistic. They're saying they're governed by prejudice, agitation, discontent, anarchy. We're a republic. We're not a democracy. Pretty good that our government printed and published this for the training manual for the people in the armed forces. Now, we're going to go to another definition, and this is in 1952, a mere 25 years later, approximately. The U.S. Army publishes the Soldier's Guide, in which it states, because the United States is a democracy, the majority of the people decide how our government will be organized and run. So from 1928 to 1952, a complete reversal. They're all of a sudden saying we are a democracy, and they're not saying all the ills of democracy. They're saying we are a democracy. And all the people who go to the armed forces get this idea, we're a democracy. And that's what we hear today, isn't it? We're a democracy. In this democracy, to uphold democracy. Wait a second. According to 1928, according to true principles, according to the founders too, democracy is a bad thing. So why are they calling us a democracy? There's an interesting little side note there, isn't there? Because once people learn what a democracy is, they buy into the idea of, oh, it's just the rule of the majority. Whatever the majority wants, they get. Cool, I like this. And you can more easily play on their passions and get things done that you want done by emotionalizing issues and by propaganda, by doing whatever you need to do that way. Alexander Hamilton says this, it has been observed that a pure democracy, if it were practicable, would be the most perfect government. Experiences prove that no position is more false than this. He says a lot of people said, look, if we could have a pure democracy where all the people come together and decide on things, that'd be the best. Why isn't that practical? He goes on to say, the ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never possessed one good feature of government. Their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity. Why would that be? Because if all the people have to come together, the merchants, the farmers, the sailors, whatever it is, they all have to get together and make decisions. They're like, I got to go. I got stuff to do. And they come, fine, I'll do that. You're going to promise that? Fine, let's just do that. Let's just move forward. We got things to do. And next thing you know, this democracy becomes a popularity contest and an efficiency issue rather than a wait, we're going to deliberate, make the right decision about these things. It's deformity, it's tyranny, it's craziness, because if everyone has to weigh in, you're never going to get anything done. And if you do get something done, it's going to be because we're going to have one big popularity contest to make something go forward that way. Hamilton states emphatically, we are now forming a Republican form of government. Real liberty is not found in the extremes of democracy, but in moderate governments. If we incline too much to democracy, we shall soon shoot into a monarchy or some other form of dictatorship. So once again, this is like the fourth witness to say, look, you go from a democracy, you hit anarchy, and you end up in a dictatorship, just like our models showed before, just like Washington said, and Adams said, and Madison said. Okay? That's what happens. That's what democracy leads towards. Now, there's some people who know a little bit about socialism and communism on this next slide, okay? And they're equating democracy into their schemes. First one is Mikhail Gorbachev. He says this, we want more socialism and therefore more democracy. Interesting. Mao Zedong, does he know anything about communism? Well, he killed 60 million people with it. He may. He says this, the democratic revolution is the necessary preparation for the socialist revolution. And the socialist revolution is the inevitable sequel to the democratic revolution. Okay? Inevitable sequel. When you have the democratic revolution, inevitably you're going to end up with the socialist revolution. Karl Marx, the founder of communism, okay? He says the first step in the revolution is to win the battle of democracy. Next, Vladimir Lenin. Just as socialism cannot be victorious unless it introduces complete democracy, so the proletariat must wage a many-sided, consistent, and revolutionary struggle for democracy. Isn't it interesting when you start to tie, when you have Adams and Washington and Jefferson, everyone's saying democracy is bad, and then you have those who are pro-communist saying democracy is good because it creates socialism and communism. I think it becomes very clear. People on both sides of the fence understand that democracy is the necessary precursor. It is the first step to communism. It is the inevitable step to communism. So when you get quotes like this from some of our previous presidents, I don't know, to me it makes me a little bit nervous. Woodrow Wilson says, we must enter World War I to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America must be the great arsenal of democracy by rushing to England's aid in World War II. You start to see that word differently now, don't you? You see democracy as a bad word instead of a positive word and go, whoa, why are they advocating for this negative thing? George W. Bush says, quote, to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture. If we're seeking to grow these democratic movements and institutions, what are we really seeking? According to Marx, or according to Washington, we're seeking socialism. Now, just as a side note, would it surprise us that what we're doing domestically, I think no one would argue that domestically what we're creating is socialism, right? Internationally, would it surprise us that what we're really advocating is socialism? If that's what we're doing domestically, wouldn't we be doing that internationally as well? It only makes sense, doesn't it? Okay? Let's get to one more quote by Woodrow Wilson. He says this, and it's interesting because he's right on. This is very true. He says, democracy is bound by no principle of its own nature to say itself nay as to the exercise of any power. Democracy, in and of itself, can do whatever it wants to do. It doesn't have to say no to itself at all. It can do whatever it wants to do. The only stipulation is that the majority wants it, and the majority can do whatever they want to do. There is no necessity to say nay to any of its power. He goes on to say, here then lies the point. The difference between democracy and socialism is not an essential difference, but only a practical difference. It is a difference of organization and policy, not a difference of primary motive. Okay? So he's equating the two. Democracy and socialism really are the same thing. And it's like the 15th time now we've heard this. It's true. Democracy leads to socialism. It's really the same thing. Okay? Are we clear on that? Does that make sense? Why they're the same? Because the rule of the majority is no rule at all. It's just complete chaos and anarchy. And ends up in a dictatorship because someone comes along and says, hey, that chaos isn't going to work. I'll solve the problem. I'll solve the problems that I caused by promoting democracy. Okay? That's the story of the Lenins and the Mao Zedongs and Stalins and Gorbachevs of the world. Okay, so we've kind of a long introduction. We've gotten a good idea here with all the quotes and all the concepts and the charts and to get us a good foundation. Now let's get into the Declaration, okay? The Declaration of Independence, we've hit this many, many times during the presentations. I want to review it one more time because it's critical to this conversation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. An interesting question here, because we always understand, look, who's the great lawgiver? The great lawgiver is God. Whose laws are we talking about here? When we talk about the rule of law, we're talking about God's laws, are we not? Okay? What unalienable rights are ours? The right to do whatever we want to do, as long as we don't infringe on someone else's rights. That's what the Declaration says. Okay? These are natural rights. They're unalienable. What's it mean to be unalienable? You can't alienate yourself from them. The fact that you were born with life, liberty, and the opportunity to pursue your happiness. You're born with that. It's unalienable. You can't say, nope, I'm alienating myself from that. You can't. Okay? That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Okay, government's job, according to the Declaration, is to protect our God-given rights, not to reflect the will of the people. That's not their job. There's actually a really big difference, okay? There's a distinction here between natural rights and positive rights. Natural rights come from God. They're unalienable, okay? Whereas positive rights, they're also called granted rights or created rights. Sometimes they're called vested rights. Those come to us from man. And if man gives you rights, if government gives you rights, they can take them away. So there's actually no right at all, are they? We talked about that in the last presentation. Okay? And these natural rights coincide with the laws of nature and of nature's God. They're natural rights. Okay? And they should be protected by government because it makes sense for nature to comply with natural law and government to make sure that exists, that there's a protection of those rights. Lastly, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We've talked about this a million times. This is a great idea, though. The government only has the powers that we ourselves possess, and then consent to give them to act on our behalf as our agent. Okay, so we established, what the Declaration talks about as far as the purpose of government, the rights of man, etc. Now we're going to get into an interesting thing that can get very confusing. The slide says popular sovereignty versus democracy. Popular sovereignty is when it's essentially the people rule, okay? In democracy, we've already established we're not a democracy and it's bad. So we understand that we're not governed by the will of the people, and yet the source of all power, according to the way our government is structured, is the individual, is the person. So the question is, do the people rule or do the people not rule? Popular sovereignty, democracy, how does that work? It can get fairly confusing and people can fall for that, saying, the people are in charge. The people are. Okay? But the people are the source of all the power. They are. The real question to be asked, though, is who's the source of all the power? It's the people. And what's in charge? It's not the people. It's not the will of the people, the will of the majority. What's in charge is the law. Okay? It's important to understand the distinction there because we can get really quickly confused into thinking, the people are in charge and therefore majority rule, and then whatever the people want is what we get. Well, and what governs us? That's not what governs us. What governs us is the law. Now, the source of the power for that law, those who made the law are the people, but the people don't govern. The law governs. Okay? And the law governs over the people and over the government. The law is what rules. All right? So, this is clearly pointed out in the preamble to the Constitution. The first three words, we the people of the United States. Okay? Remember, popular sovereignty, the source of all power is we the people. There's a little known part of the Constitution that I think makes this point. I think it's interesting to look at. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 says, no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state. What this points out to me is that we, the people, are the important ones. The government is simply the people's servants. And so to have the government take on titles of nobility is antithetical. It's anti-people. Okay? It's pro-elitism and it's anti-individualism. It's saying, I'm a king, I'm a duke, you can hear this kind of, you can hear the founders saying, we reject this whole British idea of titles of nobility because it's not the people who are in the government that are important, it's the people who are in the nation. The people in the government are simply serving the people who are the source of all the power. Okay? Interesting side note there. Getting back to the preamble, towards the end here it says, do ordain and establish this Constitution. What's it mean to ordain and establish? It means to establish it how it is, right? To write it down. You ever played the telephone game where you say one word, by the time it gets to the end, it's a totally different phrase? Well, that's what would happen if we were just an oral tradition. The oldest, longest established written constitution in the world is the United States Constitution. It's written down. It's a beautiful thing because then we can read it. We don't have to wonder, I wonder what that means. I wonder if someone interprets it. No, it's written. You can read it. That's critically important to a Republican form of government. If the law is the rule, if it's the rule of law, then you need to be able to read that law, have it ordained and established. Article 6 is pretty clear about this. This supremacy clause. It says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. The law is supreme. The Constitution is supreme. And it's supreme over the people, and it's supreme over the government. And George Washington has this to say about our supreme law of the land. He says, the Constitution which any time exists, till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. In other words, the law rules. The law prevails, not the will of the people. And you don't change that law. You don't just disregard the law. You follow the law. The only way to change it is through an authentic and explicit act, as he terms it. Okay, what's that authentic and explicit act? It's the act of the amendment. We've already talked about this in other presentations. But just to point out, in Article 5, it says, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. Okay, so you need 2/3 of both houses. And then the legislature has to ratify it by 3/4. Now notice, those aren't just simple majorities. 2/3 is a supermajority and 3/4 is what, I guess, a super majority, right? It's not just simple majority, because we're going to change the law of our land and we're not just going to do it by majority rules. And if the sacred obligatory law has to be changed by an explicit and authentic act that is a great over majority, deciding and understanding all the implications, etc., in order to change that law. Okay? Now we're going to talk a little bit more, or a little bit into the Constitution, what it has to say about this Republican form of government. In Article 4, Section 4, Clause 1, it says, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. Okay? So some people ask me, what type of government are we? And I think the best answer is we're a constitutional republic. Because republic means rule of law. What's our law? The Constitution. So a constitutional republic. Okay? And our freedoms are strengthened by the idea that at every level of government we have a republic. Article 4, Section 4, Clause 1 says that each state has to have a republic in their form of government. The states aren't even allowed to have democracies, right? Because the republic, the only way for the federal republic to survive is to have republics underneath. We have to have a rule of law, otherwise there's chaos and anarchy, like we talked about before. So Madison offers a little bit of an explanation of the difference between a democracy and a republic when he says, in a democracy, the people meet and exercise the government in person. In a republic, they assemble and administer it by their representatives and agents. Okay? So, like Hamilton talked about before, some people say, what's the best way? Let's just all meet together. And he said, that's not a good way. And Madison's making the point here is a republic, you have representatives. That's the essence behind a republic. You have representatives who are empowered, okay, given and granted the authority to make laws on behalf of the citizens. Now, in regards to those laws that are made in a republic, it's an interesting side note that Madison makes there. I just had to throw this in because it's very, very prophetic. He says this, it will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, if they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. Does that ring a bell to anybody? Does it sound familiar? We're talking about, we got to pass it to find what's in it, etc. Those types of ideas. Voluminous, always changing. Wow, Madison makes this comment. He says, look, law is defined to be a rule of action. But how can that be a rule which is little known and less fixed? Okay? So referring to republic, there can be some challenges in a rule of law if those laws are always changing, never known, so voluminous and no one ever reads them. He makes some good points, doesn't he? And some prophetic points. Another thing he makes, and this is also kind of a side note, but I think it's interesting. He says, if this spirit shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. So, talk to me about the government's health care program. Talk to me about the government's pension program. They serve one term and they're paid for life, right? Talk to me about all the different laws that are put upon the people, but that are given exemptions to the government. Is that a challenge? Well, Madison says it is, and he goes so far as to say if we actually tolerate that, we'll be in a position where we're tolerating anything but liberty. And I think we might find ourselves there today, aren't we? All right, so he goes on further to define what a republic is. We've got Madison after Madison after Madison, but I guess he's the father of the Constitution, so we'll let him. We may define a republic to be a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people for a limited period or during good behavior. Okay? So it's not like someone just forever is now a public servant. There's a limited period. It's during good behavior. There's some restrictions on that grant of power. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. Because if it was an inconsiderate proportion or favored class, then what would it be? It would be government by the elite. It would be an oligarchy. He's saying in a republic, it needs to be all the people who get together and they choose who their representatives are. It's critical. He concludes by saying, it is sufficient for such a government that the persons administering it be appointed either directly or indirectly by the people. I want to point out, what does that mean? How do the people directly appoint their public servants? By the vote, right? In the ballot box. How do they indirectly appoint their public servants? Well, those who they vote for appoint positions within the government. Okay? And there's a separation, because sometimes people say, we should vote for every single position. Well, maybe not. The founders said, no, let's make a distinction in some cases, because we don't want the passions of the masses, the easily persuaded ideas and opinions and demagogues to throw out all these different ideas and have people say, yeah, let's do that, and make every single position an elected position that becomes a popularity contest. We want to have some type of Republican form of government where there's some representation, there's some distance between the people and their public servants. There's certain areas where that's advisable, okay, to make it so it's less of a democracy and more of a republic. Okay? One last little insert I wanted to have, and then I find these little things I want to throw in. This is a really funny one, I think. Article 1, Section 4, Clause 2 says the Congress shall assemble at least once in every year. Were the founders serious about limited government? Yes, they were. They essentially said, look, we only gave you a few things to do, but you better at least show up once a year. Isn't that so ironic when you compare it to today, huh? And you know Jefferson's quote, right, where he said something to the effect of, that government which governs best is the government which governs least. Okay? Gets out of the way. We talked about that in the economics presentation. Okay, so now let's get into this idea of those people, those public servants who are directly elected by the people. We're going to start talking now about the House, okay? Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states. A couple things to emphasize here. The first thing is, by the people of the several states. Very simple, we all know this. The House is chosen by the people, correct? The House represents the people. Now, another thing to emphasize, they're chosen every second year. What does that do? Every second year, you're essentially campaigning all the time with all your votes, right? You're staying very, very close to the people who are the source of the power in our government. Okay, so we want to keep them close. We want to make sure that happens. So the founders set it up so that they'd be very, very close to what the people want. And it kind of leans toward this idea of a democracy in some ways. The other thing about the House is the House has the power, a very important power, over the purse. And so the founders limited their length of service because they have power over the purse. They need to make sure that they're not just getting away with stuff. They need to always be held accountable by the people. Okay, so that's that side, where the people are represented. Another little thing I like to bring up is in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, it says, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included in this union according to their respective numbers. Now notice, this is something that may not be discussed very much. Notice the congressional districts don't cross state lines. We don't take our 300 million some odd people and divide it by 435 congressional districts, and therefore every single person is equally represented in the House of Representatives. It's not. It's within the state. Okay? So you get states like Wyoming that are highly represented. We have one representative for every 550,000 people. You have states like Montana, actually, that has about 1.1 million people that are represented by their representative. Okay? So it's interesting. And people like to say in Wyoming, well, our vote doesn't count. Well, it counts in the House, at least, nearly twice as much as the House vote in Montana. Okay? In Montana, it's one rep per 1 million people. In Wyoming, it's one rep per 550,000 people. Now let's go over to the state side, okay? The Senate. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1 says, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state for 6 years. Okay? Now, piggybacking on the same idea we just talked about as far as representation goes, in the Senate, it's even more disproportionate. The people are even more disproportionately represented. In Wyoming, we have 2 senators for 550,000 people. That means they're represented at a rate of 1 senator to 275,000 people. Do you know what it is in California? Their rate is 1 senator per around 19 million people. We're 40, 50 times as much represented in the Senate as California is. And people so often say, well, Wyoming doesn't have a voice anyway. We only have 3 congressional delegates. And I say, we have the best voice out there. There is no citizen of any state who's more represented than a citizen in Wyoming. And why is that so? Why? Some people say, well, that's not fair because you guys get more representation. The reason it's so is because of the principle of federalism. It makes sure the states are represented and the states have their say, and we have a Republican form of government with different levels of federalism, different levels of government being represented instead of just the mass population being represented equally at the federal level. That's why that's important. Okay? Going on to discuss this a little bit more, the emphasis on this idea of every 6 years. Remember, the House is chosen every 2 years to keep it close to the people, and that's more of a democracy idea, right? Keep it close to the people. Whereas the Senate is every 6 years, okay? It's more of a distant, unemotional, logical, what's the word here? Thoughtful approach, okay, to stifle just the reaction to their constituents who are the people who want this and that and the other. And I want to get reelected, so I must do this. In the Senate, it's every 6 years, and they're able to see out. They may pass a bill in their first year or second year in service, and they see that bill's going to come to fruition within the next 4 years. I better make sure it's a good bill. Whereas in the House, man, you can pass bills all day long. You may never even see them come to pass during that term. Okay, and you can explain them away to your constituency, etc. But in the Senate, it's more of a reserved, thoughtful approach. All right, long-term perspective. Madison has this to say: "It is a misfortune incident to Republican government that those who administer it may forget their obligations to their constituents and prove unfaithful to their important trust. In this point of view, a Senate as a second branch of the legislative assembly, distinct from and dividing the power with a first, must be in all cases a salutary check on the government. It doubles the security to the people by requiring the concurrence of 2 distinct bodies in schemes of usurpation or perfidy, where the ambition or corruption of one would otherwise be sufficient." Notice once again, the founders put in by having a Senate, which is a bicameral legislature, 2 different houses. By having the Senate, once again, they put a check on democracy. They put a check on the idea of just running wild with whatever the people want by having a second body, the Senate. Okay? The people don't just get whatever they want. The Senate can block bills that don't represent the state well, that are unfunded mandates, that don't make sense, that are popular bills but destructive bills. The Senate can block that and preserve the state's rights. Okay? Now, Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1 has an interesting little ellipse here. And the ellipse is kind of a powerful and important issue. Because what happened originally, it says in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1, that the Senate was chosen by the legislature thereof in each state. So the states had their rights represented at the national level, at the federal level. But as we all know, the 17th Amendment changed the wording to be elected by the people thereof. A lot of people claim in 1913, in the 17th Amendment, it destroyed our republic and made it into a democracy. You can see where they're coming from, okay? I don't think it did it entirely, but you can see where they're coming from, because essentially what happened was the people are already represented in the House, and then because of the 17th Amendment, the states are no longer represented in the Senate. The people are double represented in the Senate. And so this nice check on unfunded mandates, on top-down intrusion that was there, got eliminated with the 17th Amendment. And the states no longer had that, and we destroyed one level of our Republican form of government. Why does that matter? Well, it matters. We've talked about this in other presentations. For instance, with Obamacare. In Obamacare, these 30 states that sued the federal government, somewhere in that number of 30 states, would presumably have 60 senators in the Senate, wouldn't they? And presumably they would not have allowed Obamacare to get passed. If the states are against it, then wouldn't their senators be against it as well? Yes, they would, and we wouldn't have Obamacare today. So you see kind of a real fruit of the consequence of not following the Constitution, but amending it for what was a popular idea of, well, everyone's vote should count. My vote should count. That's a popular idea. That's a populist idea. It's a democracy idea. My vote should count. Not recognizing that by doing that, they destroyed the power of the Senate to represent the states and check any crazy ideas, bad ideas that come from the populace or from popular ideas or out of the House. Okay? All right, so moving forward, Article 1, Section 5, Clause 3 talks about accountability to the people, because we're the people who are in charge, right? So they should be held accountable to us. There are public servants. It says this: each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings and from time to time publish the same. That makes sense. We want to know what they're doing. Okay? An interesting little part that not a lot of people believe is in the Constitution says, accepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. Is that really in there? Yeah, it is. When would, in their judgment, whatever they need to remain in secrecy, not have anyone know what their plans are? Maybe war or national security issues? They may need to do that, huh? What about, let's look back at 1787. When they were constructing in the Constitutional Convention, they were constructing our Constitution. What did they do? They swore an oath of secrecy. They draped all the windows. They locked the door, put a sentry there to make sure no one was listening in. And for 4.5 months, they worked in secret. Why? Because the people, the popular movement, said, no, we don't want a stronger central government. We already had a central government. We don't want that. But the founders knew we need a stronger central government. Without a stronger central government, we're going to fall apart. Articles of Confederation aren't cutting it. We need a constitution. And so what they did is they had secrecy in order to give to the people what they would have rejected, but what was in their best interest. Interesting. We had good and moral and virtuous men do that. Nowadays, we tend to think, oh, don't keep anything secret from us. We want it transparent, right? Because that secrecy clause it can be and is being abused, right? So it is in there, though, because it makes sense as part of what needs to happen if we're going to have moral and good, virtuous people in our legislature. They could do that. Lastly, the yeas and the nays of the members of either house on any question shall, at the desire of 1/5 of those present, be entered on the journal. So if 20% of the House says, hey, we want to have a roll call vote, what happens? They go through and actually list what people vote. Why? Because the people have learned that what matters is not what the representative or the senator says. What matters is how they vote. They can talk all day long how they're against welfare, redistribution of wealth, but then if they vote on a bill that does so, it doesn't matter what the rhetoric, it matters what their vote is. Okay? So that's Article 1, Section 5, Clause 3, an important one. Another one is Article 1, Section 5, but Clause 1 is this idea of what a quorum constitutes. It says a majority of each house shall constitute a quorum to do business. Now, we in Wyoming have one representative in the House. Let's say that one representative isn't there one day. They're sick, have to stay home. We're not being represented, so the business of the nation shouldn't go forward, right? Because Wyoming citizens aren't being represented? No. Because what would that do? That would put one person in charge of stopping the business of the nation. And talk about rule by the people, ruled by a small minority. Just one person can stop that. So they say it's important that the business goes forward, so we're going to base this on a quorum. Okay? As long as the majority of each house is present, that'll constitute a quorum, and they can go forward and do things. Another interesting aspect of this idea is in Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2, it says each house may determine the rules of its proceedings. Okay, it's important that each house is autonomous. They get to choose how they act, what are their rules. And in each case, everyone's heard about the Robert's Rules of Orders, and they all think that both the House and the Senate work on the Robert's Rules of Orders. That's not true. It's very, very similar. But in the House, their rules are governed by what's called the Jefferson's Manual. And in the Senate, their rules are based on what's called the Standing Rules of the United States Senate. These are the rules that the House and the Senate put into place with their Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 authority to govern how they run things. And let's think, how do they run things? When they're going to run a bill, what do? Do they need a supermajority? Do they need a minority vote? What do they need? They just need a simple majority, right? That's how they pass bills. So does rule of majority, does democracy show up anywhere in the Constitution? Actually, it does in the respective legislative houses because they pass bills with simple majorities, okay? A little diagram that I think is very good shows this idea that in a democracy, you have majority rule that's completely unrestrained. Majority rule is the rule always. Whereas in a constitutional republic, you do have majority rule, but it's restrained by the Constitution. Okay? So there are elements of democracy in the Constitution, but they're very much restrained by the law within a republic. Okay, so another part of the Constitution that talks about majority rule is in Article 7. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of rattling off clause after clause after clause that addresses these things, but I think it shows some interesting points. Article 7 says, the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying the same. They could have chose 7 out of 13, which would have been a simple majority, but they chose 9 out of 13, a supermajority. And that's consistent with what we've seen the founders do. When we're talking about the law, we're talking about changing the law, we're adopting a law, we'll go with a supermajority. Okay? Now, Majority rule is an important part of how we operate because when it comes down to it, there's really only two options, okay? You either rule by majority or by minority. And minority doesn't make any sense. Some people say, well, the third option is unanimity, right? That's what the Articles of Confederation said. They said 13 out of 13 states. The founder said that doesn't make any sense because what is unanimity really? It's really a minority rule because all you need is 1 out of the 13 states to say no. And then next thing you know, you have major minority rule because only 1 out of 13 states can stop the whole process. So it makes sense to do majority rule. There's no other option. Super minority rule or minority rule or majority rule. Of course, majority rule. We have to move forward. Madison put it this way: the public business must in some way or another go forward. If a pertinacious minority can control the opinion of a majority, the majority, in order that something may be done, must conform to the views of the minority. That doesn't make any sense for that to be the way you set things up. And thus the sense of the smaller number will overrule that of the greater and give a tone to the national proceedings. Hence, tedious delays, continual negotiation and intrigue, contemptible compromises of the public good. Okay, so I think he kind of nails it on the head. Jefferson says, okay, hold on. Remember, Jefferson's always the people's person. So well, let's make sure all too will bear in mind this sacred principle that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will, to be rightful, must be reasonable. Okay? That the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate would be oppression. So yes, the majority must rule, but we must always protect the minority, and that's why it's the rule of law and not just the rule of the majority. All right? The majority establishes those laws, but those laws must be rightful and must protect the rights of the minority and the majority. Okay, so up to this point, we've talked about these directly appointed, right, elected officials, people, and how all this works out, and how the majority rule plays in a little bit. Now we're going to talk about the indirectly appointed officials and public servants. All right, probably the most well-known public service position in the United States is the President of the United States, and the President of the United States is not popularly elected, contrary to popular opinion. He's not popularly elected. Okay, let's look how the Constitution set this up. It's really kind of an interesting thing that gives us some insight into some of the Republican form of government they put together. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. The emphasis is, first, this idea that each state shall appoint electors. The original wording and intent of the Constitution was to maintain a republican or representative form of government in which the states, okay, were represented by electors, and those electors elected the president. Okay? That was good because what it did is it kept this whole idea of a popularity contest, a populist vote, out of the system. We're not going to have just a popularity contest to have our president. And it keeps it away from these empty campaign promises, expensive ideas and campaigns and slogans, etc. Keeps that out of the hands of just a popular, passionately swayed, easily tricked or confused populace. Okay, the idea is when it comes down to it, the president really doesn't have much to do with the individual's personal lives anyway. The president is the president of the United States. So why would not the states be choosing the president, who's the chief executive of the states when they act in concert on external duties? It makes sense that the states would be the ones to appoint the electors who then vote for the president. Right? Second part of this is it says that the number of electors is going to be equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. So in Wyoming, for instance, we have 1 rep, we have 2 senators, therefore we have 3 electors. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now the process by which they vote, it says in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3, the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, of whom at least one shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president. Okay? So each elector in each state was free to choose and decide whoever they wanted to vote for president, with one stipulation. They had to have one of the people they vote for, if those 2 votes cast, cannot be a resident of their state. Very clearly, this system was not based on a popular vote. George Washington was never elected a popular vote. He was elected unanimously, actually, by all the electors in the various states, but it wasn't a popular vote. The person who gets the greatest number of votes is the president. It's pretty simple. Nextly, after the choice of president, the person having the greatest number of votes of the electors shall be the vice president. So first place gets the presidency, second place gets the vice presidency. All right? Now, what could happen, and what did happen, first and second place may not be in the same party. They may not have similar ideas. They may be enemies. Okay? That's what happened very early on in one of the very first elections. And they certainly didn't run on the same ticket. So the president, vice president could be on different tickets. Now, one thing that's interesting to point out is at the beginning here, we skipped through this, we didn't focus on it. It says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So each state's in charge of appointing their electors, but the states can choose to have a different form than what the original intent of the founders was. And what happens nowadays is nearly every state legislature has passed laws, has used their Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 authority to pass laws to say that what we're going to do is a winner-take-all popular vote. Whoever wins the popular vote in our state is going to get all the electors, and those electors are bound to vote for the party who wins the popular vote. What does that do? That makes it more and more feel like a popularity contest, which it is. And it's destructive of what the original intent was, is each elector gets to choose, each state is represented. Instead, it's for the people, the people, the people. And that's why you have all these empty campaign promises, expensive advertising, commercials, signage, all that, because they're trying to reach the people. You don't need to reach the people in the original way it was set up, because they're not going to be, these electors are going to look into the issues. They're going to decide for themselves based on their experience with government and see right through these empty promises that the masses may say, give me that. Yep, if you promise me this, sure, I'll vote for you. You bet. Okay, because that can easily happen. Now, there's something called the National Popular Vote movement that's taken it one step further. The National Popular Vote is going on the same idea, the same concept that the 17th Amendment was. Your vote should count. Every person's vote should count, and we should have a national popular vote for the president. And what they're doing is they're circumventing what the intent of the Electoral College is, and they're saying, we want each legislature to use their Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 power to write a law that says, regardless of what happens in our state, whoever wins the national popular vote, that's where our state's electoral votes will go. So, for instance, in Wyoming, we're a very Republican state. Republicans always win here. Our 3 electoral votes would be up for grabs if, in the national popular vote, a Democrat won the vote. Then our 3 votes, because the law that was passed by our state legislature, would actually be committed to the Democrat Party instead of to the Republican Party with the National Popular Vote movement. What they're trying to do is say, oh, well, that's good, because then it's just a popularity contest. It's more democratic. We don't want it to be more democratic. We don't want to have it just be a popular movement. That's the whole point of the Electoral College, to keep that level of federalism, to keep the states choosing instead of the people choosing. Think about the natural consequences. You'd have a dozen or so highly, highly populated cities that would make all the decisions about who's the president, right? Because that's where the populace is. And we already know the populated cities, how do they vote? They vote where they can get the most benefit, okay? Always, they vote more of the populist idea, more of the Democrat, liberal, progressive idea, because they know they can get more out of the government. We're going to end on 2 different quotes that talk about this, that I think wraps up this whole idea again. This is actually a repeat from earlier in the presentation. I think it says it so concisely. Alexander Fraser Tytler says, a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy, always followed by a dictatorship. Remember that quote and that concept? It comes very clear when we start to look at some of these things. I'm going to end with a quote that I think is pretty powerful. Dr. Adrian Rogers says, what one person receives without working for, another person must work for without receiving. The government cannot give to anybody anything that the government does not first take from somebody else. When half of the people get the idea that they do not have to work because the other half is going to take care of them, and when the other half gets the idea that it does no good to work because somebody else is going to get what they work for, that, my dear friend, is about the end of any nation. And that's why we need to avoid a democracy. Democracies always implode. They always commit suicide. They don't last long. They're violent in their deaths as they're short in their lives, as the founders have said. It's very, very important that we understand democracy and we understand how to avoid it and not promote it. So when people are saying, oh, we're a democracy, we don't want that to be promulgated because it's not true. And once people understand what a democracy is and they think we're a democracy, they'll say, hey, I guess it's all just in the will of the majority. It's all just the will of the people. That is not what America is. America is a republic. It was meant to be so, and it should be so in order to protect our freedoms.